I'm the CTO of Joyent. Joyent was actually the company that was the steward of Node.js from 2010 to 2015. And I want to talk today and reflect both backwards and a bit forwards and try to understand the trajectory of the Node community, because we can now actually look back to 2010 and look forward as well. And we've seen a bunch of things happen in the community. And we can, I think, begin to explain some of what we have seen happen. And certainly we at Joyent have tried to explain what we've seen happen. And one of the kind of the big themes that we see is around values. Values are what's important to you. And we all believe that all of us have the same things that are important to us because they're important to us. So of course they're important to you. But that's not quite the case. The things that are important to me may be important to you, but maybe they're not quite as important as something that is important to me, but not quite as important as what's important to me. These things vary in terms of their priorities. And when you select a software platform, selecting the values of that community is very important. I mean, this is part of what we do now in the open source age, where we no longer buy a product from a company. We choose a platform and, in part, a community, in a big part, a community. And when we choose that community, we are choosing the values of that community. What is important to that community? So it's, we always talk about the right tool for the job. When it comes to the software platform, it's not only the right tool for the job, it's the right values for the job. What do the values that I want to do for this particular job or in this particular organization? And then I'm going to pick the right software for the values. So let's be specific here. What are we talking about in terms of platform values? And these are a bunch of attributes of platforms. If you're wondering, as Keynote did, is debuggability a word? Yes, God damn it, debuggability is a word. So just want to clarify that one right off the bat. Take that, Keynote. But these are all words, I assert. And these are all attributes of platforms. And these are all good things. There's nothing up here that's bad. There's nothing up here that you don't want. It's like, I want people to be able to move slowly in my platform. I want it to be insecure. I want it to be totally unapproachable. I don't want it to operate. I mean, no one actually wants that. That just happens to some things, right? But no one actually sets out wanting those things. We want all of these things. And we delude ourselves into thinking that we get to have all of them. We want all of these things, so let's have all of these things. It's like, well, it's not exactly right, because there are core values in a platform. These values are all equal, but some are more equal than others. And the values that are more equal than others are going to vary by platform. Each platform is going to define their subset of values. These are our core values, that if we have to make a choice between this value and that value, we're going to choose this one. And the problem is that those core values are often not articulated. You've got to figure it out a bit after the fact. And so the values themselves then attract a like-minded community. They become self-reinforcing. So it's very important to understand what those core values are. So let's do some hopefully non-controversial warm-up exercises. Of course, I'm presenting, so 7th edition Unix is absolutely going to come up. I'm not going to mention the IBM 1401, but I am going to talk about 7th edition Unix. 7th edition Unix, so this is the original Unix as conceived in the early 70s in Bell Labs. What were the core values of early Unix? Well, first and foremost, simplicity. Right? Unix is a pun. It's a pun on Multics and eunuch. It's a little bit of an off-color pun, but it's a pun. That simplicity is the core organizing value of Unix. Its simplicity, it was portable. At a time when operating systems were not portable, it was portable and it was composable. Those of us who have worked in Unix for entire careers actually regret that, to a certain degree, that these were the core values, because the simplicity overshot the mark. Unix was too simple in any number of ways. But these were the core organizing values of 7th edition Unix. Let's take another easy one, OpenBSD. There's only one value in OpenBSD. And if you're an OpenBSD person and you're but stammering right now, come on. Like, all you really care about is security. Anything else is just another word for security. It's like, no, we care about simplicity. It's like, no, you refuse to run any software because it's not secure. But it's simple. It's like, no, it's secure. You care about security. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with only caring about security. The world needs OpenBSD. They need a community that offers a clarity by caring only about one thing at arbitrary cost. I admire it. But this is OpenBSD, only security. How about K? Do people know K? There we go, the K fanboys. Jake Love was in the front row. He's got the lighter out for K. K looks like line noise, okay? K is a language developed by Arthur Whitney, maybe the world's smartest human. Arthur Whitney is so unbelievably smart that I don't care who you are. Whenever he says something incomprehensible, you immediately blame yourself for not understanding it. He once told me, actually, I was interviewing him for the ACM, and I asked him, what do you feel the closest analog is to software? And I was expecting, like, software's like a bridge, or software's like a biological system, or software's something that's like, I don't know, something that seems reasonable. And he pauses and says, software's like poetry. I was like, mushroom cloud. I mean, I think I had a seizure. But that's Arthur. So Arthur wants things to be as expressive and tight and beautiful and high-performing as possible. That is all Arthur cares about. And K is to performance and expressiveness what OpenBSD is to security. And yes, it's terrifying. So that's K. How about awk? Awk is another near and dear one to my heart. Awk, one of the first important string processing languages, certainly the first one that was approachable. And if you're like, awk is definitely not approachable, I hereby order you to write a program in Snowball, which is what preceded awk, and is absolutely, totally unapproachable. So awk is approachable, it's expressive, it's simple, and it enshrines velocity. If you read the opening paragraph of the awk book, which, by the way, if you want to understand a platform's values, go to the opening paragraph of the book written by the authors of the language. That opening paragraph will tell you what their core values are. Don't go looking for the one on JavaScript, though. Foreshadowing, ominous foreshadowing, right? There is no book on JavaScript, and yes, this is a problem, and we're going to get to it in just a moment. So that's awk. ZFS, the file system that we developed at Sun, and we built everything on Joyent on. Integrity, robustness, operability, simplicity. Actually, a really hard one for me to figure out is dtrace. I developed dtrace. I'm the father of dtrace. I'm like, wait a minute, what are my core values again? It can be hard to figure out what your own core values are. But you know what's more important than anything else to you. Safety, operability. The fact that you can do this in a production system. These are the third rails that you cannot cross in dtrace. And debuggability, of course, we believe you should debug we should debug systems in production. Why is velocity on there? Because a core aspect of dtrace, which is a facility for instrumenting systems in production, is the ability to instrument a system quickly and get a response quickly. If it takes you 10 minutes to compile a program, that's way, way, way too slow. So that velocity and expressiveness is very important to dtrace as well. All right, so what about Node? Now we've arrived at Node circa 2010. What are the values of Node? Well, having known Ryan, at the time, Ryan Dahl, going back to the 2009, you should definitely watch the 2009 JSConf EU talk by Ryan, is a classic. It's an amazing story, actually. It is a kind of a rags to riches, if not metaphorical, where Ryan is basically, this is his last best shot for software. He presents himself at JSConf EU, if you're there in 2009, and he is, with zero kind of, and people there's no one who's really even aware of what he's doing, and he reveals Node, and of course Node immediately takes off. Why did Node take off? What were Ryan's values? Ryan's values were really, and you kind of go to that opening paragraph again, it was about simplicity and performance. It was about, here you can write a highly performing async program in a very small number of lines of code. That simplicity and the performance, and then the approachability of JavaScript. Those were kind of Ryan's core values, I would argue, in 2010. And again, there are a lot of values here, and there's a lot of overlap, but if you had to pick three, those are the three that I would pick. All right, so what about Joyent? So Joyent's core values are a bunch of these other values, and there's a bunch of overlap here, but what do these values have in common? These are what I would call production-oriented values. Values around robustness, safety, stability, thoroughness, transparency, maintainability, integrity, compatibility, debuggability, rigor, resiliency. And yes, I've got more values here than I've got for a particular platform because it's an organization. It will naturally have more values. And these values do have some overlap. But you'll notice that I have to be honest with myself. And it's like, wait a minute, Joyent doesn't care about performance? No, that's not the case. Joyent does care about performance, but we have to pick between performance and robustness. We pick robustness. It's like, and of course, Scott Hammond, Joyent CEO, is saying, I knew it. You don't care about approachability. You don't want to make things easy for people. You want to make things hard for people. I knew it. I've got you red-handed. And it's like, it's not false, but it's also not true. Because we do want things to be approachable, but they can't be approachable at a cost of robustness and debuggability and compatibility and so on. Now, you'll notice one that is not on here that I didn't highlight that really should be highlighted by any cloud provider, and that's security. And that's, again, me being honest with myself about we care about security, but we kind of cared about security in a bit of a conversational sense. We weren't actually making the really tough choices we need to make to really care about security as being more important than something else. And then something changed. What happened is we had someone who presented us with an exploit. And boy, there is nothing more clarifying than having someone present you with an exploit in your own software. It's a moment where you know your true character because you do think to yourself, if I murder this person, will no one ever know? Okay, you don't actually think that to yourself, but you have these thoughts because you are forced to come eyeball to eyeball with your own fallibility as a software engineer. And we had a guy who found an exploit in our software. So we did a very important thing. We hired him. That's Alex Wilson. And when Alex came, he brought a whole new way of thinking about security to Joyent. There is a very fine line when it comes to security between the policing mind and the criminal mind. And you need to have some, I'm not accusing Alex of being a criminal, I'm just making some observations, that you need to have enough criminal mind to be able to challenge your own thinking. And that was introduced to Joyent only a couple of years ago, but it was really changed the way we're thinking and the way we prioritize things. So I would add security now. So how do you actually grow your core values? Well, I think the hiring of Alex shows the easiest way to grow core values. You grow core values by expanding, by finding people that have those values, expanding, and having those values come cheek to cheek with the values of the community. So, and ideally, that's what you want to do. Ideally, you want to grow with people. And in 2010, in Node, we had a terrific opportunity. Why? Because we had a huge influx coming into Node. Node in 2010 was really the best thing going because it was easy to write these high-performance applications. You had JavaScript. V8 was a super high-performance engine. And you're coming from Twisted Python, Event Machine, or C. You're coming from environments that made it really, really, really hard. And that Node made it so easy was a revolution. So we had this huge influx. And I personally was really optimistic that we were going to actually have this industrial-grade, robust server-side JavaScript. And I wrote a blog entry shortly after I joined Joyent. I joined Joyent in 2010, in part because I was excited by what I saw with Node, and I was pleasantly surprised by what I called the Node.js demographic. Those people had been attracted to Node. These were not lightweights. These were people who were veterans of deploying systems, who'd done it in lots of other languages, lots of other platforms, had a ton of wisdom. Wisdom being a euphemism for scar tissue. You only learn things by getting them wrong. I mean, I would love to say that you learn things by either getting it wrong or listening to someone else who got it wrong and happening to retain some subset of that. But you don't retain all of it until you get it wrong yourself. That's just the sad reality of the human condition. Sorry to break that to you. But we had people who had done it the wrong way in other platforms and had learned from that. And I was really optimistic that we were going to be able to incorporate some of these robust values into Joyent. And we spent the next couple of years living the values that we have and being the change that we wanted to see in Node. Around, I would say, debuggability first and foremost. We added detrace probes in Node. We added detrace probes in arbitrary Node.js. We added MDB support, debugger support for post-mortem debugging of Node, where you can take a core dump from a Node process and be able to debug up into JavaScript state. A problem that I didn't think was solvable until Dave Pacheco at Joyent solved it. An amazing, amazing technology, developing a UStack helper for Node.js, help us to debug systems running in production. We're trying to grow the community with rigor. So flame graphs, people probably know flame graphs at this point. Flame Graph started here in Node.js at Joyent. Brendan Gregg was at Joyent and invented flame graphs because of the problem we had around all of these Node.js stacks, trying to make sense of them and applying our values of rigor upon all of this data. So it started here. It started here, which is great, certainly, but I'm a bit mixed about that in hindsight. I'll tell you why in a bit. But so flame graphs. And then in terms of maintainability, as we built out our own services on top of Node.js, we needed a bunch of facilities. We needed a logging facility. We developed Bunyan in 2012. It was funny, I was reviewing these slides, some of the engineers are like, wait, we only did Bunyan in 2012? What were we doing in 2011? It's like, you do not want to know the answer to that question. It's like, you know the answer to that question. It begins with console and ends with log. But Bunyan was critically important to us. Bunyan has built-in dtrace probes, allows us to walk up to a microservice that's running in production, dynamically turn on all of its logging, all of its warn logging, its debug logging, to figure out what it's actually doing without restarting the service. We've used this over and over and over and over again. This is how we build maintainable software with these super stable, powerful elements of foundation. In terms of robustness, we saw modules in the ecosystem that didn't exactly fit our values and realized that we needed to write our own. So that started with, we developed our own for REST-based services called Restify, which is still in very active use, that really focused on RFC compliance. Again, debuggability, a very common theme. If you take only one thing away from this talk, it's please replace async with vasync. If we have done a disservice to this community, it's to not adequately communicate the robustness differences between vasync and async. A lot of people use async, not many people use vasync, and we've got one software engineer that's working on a project that took him longer than he would have liked, and he's like, if I only knew in the beginning to rip out all of the async and replace it with all of the vasync, I would have saved myself so much time. Because he had so many really nasty bugs that were ultimately bugs in async, or quirks of async. Vasync is really designed around robust error handling and debuggability. And in terms of understanding memory growth, this is dynamic programs grow in memory. It's very easy to accidentally hold on to references to things where you've got these big object graphs that can't be GC'd because they're not actually garbage. How do you debug that problem? Again, we had a customer in production, Matt Ranney, who then at Voxer, he's like, you've got to help me debug this problem. These services are dying. And we put our heads together and like, maybe we could go back into the postmortem technology that we developed that allows us to debug a core file and actually just brute force over that core dump and find all of the JavaScript-looking objects and report that. We did that with find.js objects, and then we added the ability to go over functions with JS functions, and then closures with JS closure, which is amazing. Time does not permit me to demo it, but is absolutely amazing to be able to take a closure and look from a core dump, from a process that died in production 5 days ago, be able to take a closure and look at the variables that are bound to that scope is just mind-bending, and we've used it over and over and over and over again to debug problems in production. In terms of stability, we saw the very first problem we saw was the need for a stable interface for add-ons. The first conversation I had with Ryan Dahl about that was August 1st, 2010, my first day at Joyent, was when he and I were both like, we have got to solve the stable interface problem. It's great that 7 years later, we have an API or NAPI or whatever it is. That's terrific. It's been too long a struggle to get to that stable interface. We just had the need to do it ourselves. We did something called V8+, which put a stable C interface on top of the unstable C++ interface of V8. We use that in lieu of NAN or NAPI for a bunch of reasons that we can talk about during the break. But stability, very, very, very important to us. Resiliency, very important to us. One of the things that we learned as we were actually putting things into production, node-based services in production, these things fail in really nasty, nasty ways. And Dave Pacheco and TJ Fontaine, who was then at Joyent, wrote an incredible doc on this. Again, if you only take two things from this talk, take vasync and this doc, error handling in Node.js, still the top hit, thankfully, if you Google Node.js error handling, and actually takes you through a taxonomy of errors and explain our thinking on how errors should be handled. So we were reflecting all of these values in everything we were doing. Here's the problem. Not everyone shared those values, and values aren't actually contagious, as it turns out. I wish they were, I think. But values are not necessarily contagious. And the fact that we had these values, it doesn't mean that everyone had these values. And the Node.js community, broadly defined, actually, it's not that they don't believe in robustness, it's just that, well, actually, approachability, expressiveness, and velocity are actually more important. These are these kind of growth-oriented values, JavaScript-oriented values. And it was clear by 2014 that that these value differences were increasingly coming into conflict. A fracture was, in retrospect, inevitable. And so what happened in 2014? Does anyone know what I'm referring to? IOJS. That's an excellent guess. That is not what I'm referring to. I'm referring to the most prolific Node.js contributor, the person who had written more modules than anybody else, leaving this community over points of principle, over values. This is months before IOJS. Where was the reaction? Where was the inquiry, the apology to understand why did you leave? Well, he's actually very explicit. And so, TJ was so upfront and friendly about the way he phrased this. Most people, when they reject you, don't explain why. Or they explain why in a way that's really cruel and hard to forgive or forget. TJ explained why in a way that was kind and explicit. Streams are broken. Callbacks are not great to work with. Errors are vague. These are all true things. Tooling is not great. Community convention is sort of there. If Node can fix some of these fundamental problems, it has a good chance of remaining relevant. And if it doesn't fly when there's another solution that's more performant. Performant, I don't actually think is a word, but I'm going to give it to TJ right now. More performant, I think it probably is a word, and more user-friendly. There are other options out there. And TJ was the most prolific Node contributor, but he was not the only one to leave. There were foreshocks. You probably don't know Felix. I know Felix, because I was here in 2010. If you're here in 2020, you know Felix. And you're still a little bit heartbroken over the departure of Felix. Terrific, terrific technologist. Went to go in 2012. And didn't necessarily explain why as much. Or it was a little more curt. But there have been Paul Querna, Tim Caswell, all these people that had been there in the beginning weren't there anymore. And I think it highlights the challenge of larger communities. When communities are large, when they get large, it's very hard to have everyone have the same values, especially if you're not constantly re-articulating those values. It's very easy for them to conflict or become diluted. Ironically, smaller communities have an easier time with this, because this is part of the reason I love small communities. Small communities identify, you think like, hey, we should all want to be OpenBSD, right? Where there's such a strong identity around values. Yes, it's small, but it has a very strong identity. It doesn't suffer from this pathology. And sometimes the pathology is a fork. We saw that, of course, with IOJS. But more often than not, people just leave. And they leave silently, by the way. They don't tell you why they're leaving. They just leave. So in terms of the divergent values, we erred, absolutely, Joyent, in 2014. We erred on not articulating what we saw, which is that the divergence in the software was actually a divergence in values. And what we learned the hard way, I'm not even sure it matters if we articulated it because the divergence was so fundamental. The divergence was the problem. We held aspirations for Node that Node didn't hold for itself. It saddens me to say that. That's not a value judgment. That's an observation. And it's me trying to assemble why things went the way they've been. And I think part of the problem is the values of Node have always been the values of JavaScript. These are JavaScript's values. And there's nothing wrong with these values. These are good values. But it's clear that our values were simply not going to align, ever. So we transitioned Node into a foundation in 2015. But we knew that we didn't walk away from it because we knew there were people in the community, many of whom who are in this room, who do share our values, who wanted us to help to extend the Node community's values. So we remained engaged, and it has not been easy. There's one issue in particular, and you might know where I'm going with this. There's one issue in particular that really highlights the divergence of these values, and that's promises. And I'm not here to denigrate promises. I'm really not. I'm here to explain. I'm here to use promises to explain a fundamental divergence in values. Promises first invented by Barbara Liskov. If anyone needs to take down Arthur Whitney as world's smartest human, I might nominate Barbara to go do it. Turing Award winner, has given us all sorts of contributions to computer science. And she invented promises effectively in the 80s as part of a clue derivative called Argus. Node actually had them, but ripped them out in 2010. But because of their use in broader JavaScript, people want promises. The problem with promises, I don't want to belabor it, but the problem with promises is they conflate operational errors with programmatic errors. And they both become exceptions. It's very difficult to differentiate these two. And the way the software acts to a type error versus an econ reset are totally, totally different. Promises makes it not impossible, but difficult to actually handle these things and then debug them properly, because you can't, it's very hard to find the origin of that type error, which you desperately need to find. Promises make writing robust software more difficult. I do believe that very firmly. Promises embody this divergence, approachability, compatibility, and expressiveness in tension with robustness, debugability, simplicity. Can we have it all? No. We can't have it all. We have to make choices. And if Node is bound to JavaScript, can it even make its own choices? That you can see this conundrum on display in this pull request, 1244.2, and here you've got Julian from Joyent saying, hey, I've got all the same concerns. This is to add, adding PromiseFi, util.PromiseFi. I've got all the concerns that I've outlined before, and here are all the concerns. And the follow-up comment, I think, is actually very good, and I want to be clear about this. I'm not denigrating either of these individuals or the follow-up comment. The follow-up comment is like, yeah, I know you pointed this out elsewhere, but promises are different by design. And I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying. But I am saying that JavaScript supports these things, so we need to support them too, and it doesn't really make sense to bring debugability into the argument. That's not wrong. That's not wrong. And Julian's not wrong. Neither of these individuals is wrong. But they've got different value systems. Both value systems are admirable. Both value systems are reasonable. But we can't accommodate both of them on this issue at one time. This was put to a vote. 9 were in favor, 1 was against. You know who that was. It's Julian. 4 abstained. I shouldn't need to tell you this in 2017. But if you just came to 2017 via time travel, let me tell you that elections do not resolve differences in values. You can have as many votes as you want. If you are not actually changing people's minds, changing their values, you are not actually resolving anything. Democracy does not necessarily imply leadership. Witness our own putative democracy. So what's the challenge for Joyent? We're resigned to the divergence of values, and it's okay. It's okay. It's not a value judgment. Because again, all of those values are important. We're not abandoning Node.js. We are continuing to develop software in Node.js. We can use Node.js. It does mean that we're looking beyond Node.js. There was a time when Node.js really was going to be the answer for the problems we were looking at. We are looking beyond it. You're going to see us active in Go. You're going to see us active in Rust. You might see us active in other communities. And you are going to see us doing some of the same things we did for Node, we will do in these other communities. We will bring our debugability, our robustness to these other communities. They're not perfect, and we know that, actually. It's actually very helpful to know that. To be able to look at Go, and there are things about Go that drive me up the wall. Things about Go that drive me insane. But knowing what our values are, we can go into that decision a little more clear-eyed. Like, we're not marrying Go. We're not marrying Rust. We didn't marry Node. But we might deploy that software for very good reasons in terms of our own values. The challenge for Node is Node needs to define what it wants to be. And if it wants to be those values, the JavaScript values, I think that's great. Let's talk about that. Let's please end claptrap around values that Node doesn't actually have. Let's not talk about robustness if we are not going to make decisions around robustness when we have to choose between robustness and approachability, or robustness and expressiveness. Let's be clear about what the values are in Node. It will benefit everybody to be upfront. I think all communities should be upfront about their values. We personally remain hopeful that Node is going to be a big enough tent that we don't have to abandon it. I still love a lot about Node, and there's still lots of things I would use about it. In general, writ large, this is not unique to Node, right? But the big tent of JavaScript does highlight this. When picking a platform, values really, really matter. If you've got a group of people you want to develop some software, get consensus on your own values before you select a platform. If you don't do this, you are fating yourself to a war over white space. A war over white space, this is the toothpaste cap. It's never over the toothpaste cap. There are much bigger issues. If I can help resolve some of your marital or domestic problems, let me tell you, it's not about the toothpaste cap. There are bigger things going on. Not about the white space, there are bigger things going on. How do you assess the values of a community from the outside looking in? That's a challenge. I mean, the way I do that is I love to have the fortune of opening an issue on, like, oh, I've discovered a bug. I'm going to fully debug it. Here's my analysis. File issue with community. How does the community react to this? And boy, I loved the RethinkDB community before I found a bug in it. But man, the RethinkDB folks, if you use RethinkDB, I love RethinkDB in part because of the way they reacted to an issue I found. So this is one way to assess a community. And ultimately, you're going to have to balance your values and that of the community. And by the way, if you find that no community reflects your values, time to write your own. That's how every great piece of software was born, with that kind of values divergence. With that, thank you very much.